Hey sightseers, Sightseeing Sally here. Today we're checking out a small town in Wisconsin called Oconto. Located at the mouth of the Oconto River on the shores of the Bay of Green Bay, Oconto now has a population of roughly 4,500 people. At its peak in 1910, there were 5,600 living here. Now, if you're from Wisconsin, you might be wondering, why Oconto? Why are we checking out this small town? What could possibly be forgotten here? Because I'm sure most of you have already heard of Oconto, which, if you haven't, I'd like to hear from you. Leave it in the comments section below where you're from, just because I'm curious to know who out there hasn't heard of Oconto. But regardless of whether or not you know Oconto, I have a feeling that some of the history I'm about to share with you, the history that makes this town so unique, is something you've never heard before. See, what you probably didn't know is that Oconto, besides having a number of historic homes like this one, was also at one time home to the largest pickle processing plant in the United States and is the location of ancient burial grounds dating back to 5500 BC. Today we're going to explore this and more as I take you around Oconto and share with you some of Oconto's forgotten history. This, by the way, is the old O'Kelleher home that was built in 1914 as a wedding gift to Marjorie Best O'Kelleher from her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Best of Green Bay. Her husband Victor later became mayor of Oconto and eventually served as director of the Selective Service in Washington, D.C. during World War II. Then across the street from the old O'Kellehers is the Phelps Home. Built in 1895 by none other than Truman Phelps, a bookkeeper for the Holt Lumber Company, the land that this was built on was purchased for only $150. Yeah, I'm guessing it's worth a lot more than that now. Quite the Halloween setup they got here. This, by the way, is the old Ira Pendleton Home built in 1889. Then, in 1891, W.A. Holt, who became general manager of his father's business, the Holt Lumber Company, bought this home and lived here for 60 years. I love all the Halloween decorations, they're pretty cool. In the background, you can probably hear the train, which, as we've talked about in other videos, has always played an important role in bringing a town to life. Interestingly enough, the railroad came to Oconto the same year that the Peshtigo fire broke out in 1871. As you can probably tell from the number of historic homes here, Oconto was spared of this tragedy, unlike its neighboring town of Peshtigo, where 1,200-some lives were lost. If you're interested in learning more about the Peshtigo fire and seeing the museum that's in Peshtigo, check out one of my earliest Sightseeing Sally vids. I did a video there way back when, so be kind. Probably not going to win any awards with that video, but it will give you an idea of what happened during that fire. Now, as you might have guessed, we're in a historic part of Oconto. In this neighborhood, which consists of 3 blocks, there are 21 homes, a church, and the library that are all on the National Register of Historic Places. And what's really cool is you can pick up this guide from City Hall that gives you all the deets on this neighborhood, which means I won't have to wing it like I did in Alma. Don't worry though, I'm not going to go visit every single home on the list just because it might get a little repetitive, and B, that way you've got something to look forward to when you come to Oconto yourself. Now, as I mentioned, there is a church here in Oconto that's on the National Register of Historic Places, the one behind me. But it's not just any old church. It's the first Christian Scientist edifice that was ever built in the entire world. And not to be confused with Scientology, the Christian Scientists came to Oconto in 1883. And all because of one man, local resident Hugh McDonald, whose wife Emma was gravely ill. As it just so happened, MacDonald ran into a steamboat inspector who mentioned that his own wife was benefiting from the practice of prayer by Christian Scientists. With Emma being given only 6 weeks to live by doctors down in Chicago, Hugh was desperate and basically willing to try anything. In November, they ran down to Milwaukee where Emma received treatment, and by Christmas, she was better. Of course, news of Emma's miraculous treatment spread. And before you know it, there was a loyal group of Christian Scientists here in Oconto who wanted to build a church. The rest, as they say, is history. Which brings us to the story of Oconto's pickling factory. This house in front of me is known as the Bond Home, built in 1929 by Leon Bond. He was the owner of the Bond Pickle Company in Oconto. If you didn't know, the Bond Pickle Company was started in 1915 by 5 brothers. Its processing factory was somewhere along West Main Street. And while I can't tell you exactly where that was, I can tell you that by 1938, it was the largest pickle-producing factory in the United States. And at its peak in the 70s, the Bond Pickle Company spread across 3 acres and had over 800 curing tanks. I don't know about you, but I find it amazing that at one time, Oconto was home to the largest pickle-producing company in the United States. And then next door to the old Bond home is the Bronquest Home. Better known as the Governor's Mansion, it was built sometime around 1869 by William Bronquest for a total sum of $6,500. As you can see, this home is massive. And the reason it's known as the Governor's Mansion is because in the 1870s, Edward Schofield married and acquired the home. In 1887, Edward was elected to the state senate, and in 1897, he became Wisconsin's last Civil War veteran governor. Thus, it only makes sense that this home is known as the Governor's Mansion. The Governor's Mansion isn't the only house here that's impressive. Drive around Oconto and you can see a lot of old stately homes. There's quite a few of them outside of that historic district we looked at, which leads me to believe that the early European immigrants that arrived here either had a lot of money or they made a lot of money when they got here. Now, the historic homes I showed you on Main Street aren't the only old homes here in Oconto. If you go further down on Park Avenue, you'll come to these houses. On the National Register of Historic Places, this house was built in 1892 by none other than John G. Campbell. John was a timber cruiser and merchant who eventually became director and vice president of the Citizens National Bank here in Oconto. By the way, if you're wondering what a timber cruiser is, they go around and place a value on timber, basically an appraiser of wood. And over here is what is known as the Buyer Home. Built in 1868 by Cyrus and Kitty Hart, it is believed to be one of the first brick homes to be built in the county. Now, it's my understanding that after Kitty and Cyrus built the place, it passed through several owners before finally becoming the home of George and Fanny Buyer. Now owned by the Oconto Historical Society, the former home of George and Fanny serves as a museum. They even still have the old hitching posts for the horses here. Also on the National Register of Historic Places, the Buyer Home is probably one of the most iconic pieces of Oconto history. There's one more historic home I want to show you here in Oconto before we move on to something else, and that's this one here. Believed to be one of the oldest houses in Oconto, this house was built in like 1850, 1851. I'm saying like 1850-51 only because there was a little bit of a discrepancy in the dates when I was looking it up. In any case, it was built by Huff Jones, who with his father David and brother Tarleton started Oconno's first lumber mill in 1844. And Oconno County's first election was held here. They actually found documents from that election inside the house. Now here's something I wasn't expecting to come across as I was walking through Oconno. It's the Pine Lodge number 188, otherwise known as the local Masonic Temple. It's quite the massive structure. Freemasons trace their roots back to the Middle Ages, and if you didn't know, women can't belong, only men. What can you do? Anyways, I think I'm probably more likely to fit in with odd fellows. Kidding, okay? Just kidding. If you haven't figured out by now, Oconno is steeped in history, with 1 national landmark, 5 historical markers, and 28 National Register of Historic Places. This small Wisconsin town is the ideal place for those who love exploring forgotten history. What is now the location of the Oconno Yacht Club used to be the site of the Jones Lumber Mill. Much like some of the other towns we visited, Oconno's earliest European immigrants earned their livelihoods through commercial fishing and the lumber industry. What used to be the Holt and Balcom Lumber Company office is now the Brothers 3. While admittedly logging and lumber played a huge role in Oconno's commercial history, they weren't the only game in town. What's left of the former Stanley Toy Factory. Built in 1872, it was originally a music hall. Later, in 1946, Chester Schwedler, say that 10 times real fast, established the Stanley Toy Company. If you didn't know, the Stanley Toy Company made cast metal horse-drawn carriages and bunny toy carts. Now highly collectible, the reason those toys are no longer produced is because on December 29, 1949, a fire broke out, destroying much of the building and causing production to end. If we look closely on this old building, we can see that it says, "Say Pepsi, please, Pepsi-Cola." Which, considering this looks like an old tavern, I'm thinking people weren't saying that too often in there. If I had to guess, it was probably more like Paps, please. And just like in Wabeno, we also have an old style sign. Since we're talking beer signs, the reason why I haven't seen too many Blatt's beer signs in my lifetime is because back in the 60s, I wasn't even born yet. And in the 70s, I was just a little wee one. Not that I'm trying to make you feel old or anything. Now here's something that's a blast from the past. I believe it says H. Thiel, Merchant Tailor, Gents Furnishings. But there's always that chance I could be wrong. So, if you're from Oconno and you happen to see this video and you know, let me know in the comment section below what this says. Check this out, sightseers. This building has an old mural on the side of it too. If I'm not mistaken, I think it says SW Ford Drug Company, established in 1872. And now that I've had a chance to look at it more closely, it almost looks like 2 murals. One was painted right over the other. I don't know, it's a mystery. Now for those of you who need a quick history lesson on American and Wisconsin history, back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, this part of the country was under French rule. It was actually part of New France. So you had a lot of fur trading going on here. The French fur trappers were here trading with the Native Americans. The Menominee Indian tribe is the Native American tribe that was prevalent in this area. And while there really isn't too much Native American influence here now, it is an important part of Oconno's history, one that warrants being mentioned. There's obviously a lot more to Oconno's very early history than what I'm going to get into here now. However, there is something I want to share with you that I think I'd be totally remiss if I didn't bring it up, and that involves a trip out to Copper Culture State Park. But before we go there, I want to give a quick shout out to fellow sightseer and Wisconsinite Brad, who made this video possible by tipping our trip jar. So thank you, Brad. I really appreciate it. It's because of your support that I'm here today. And speaking of support, I just want to give a quick thanks to all of you, my subscribers. Those of you who've been with me since the beginning, appreciate you sticking by me. And those of you who are brand new, welcome. I hope to see you in the comments for many more videos to come. Long before the first European explorers, before the early Native Americans even, this part of Oconto was settled by an ancient people. Known as the Old Copper People for their ability to fashion tools made out of copper, these ancients are believed to have inhabited this area sometime between 2000 and 4000 BC. Now, if you can picture this, back in like the late 40s, early 50s, this area around here used to be an old gravel pit. One day a local boy was doing some digging down in the bottom of the pit. This would have been in 1952, and as he was digging, he came across some remains. Long story short, it turns out what this young boy found ended up being a huge archaeological discovery. In essence, what he had discovered was an ancient burial ground for the old copper culture people. When it was all said and done, 45 individuals were excavated by the archaeologists who came to study the site. Now, I don't know where they ended up interring those remains, but what I can tell you is that when they examined them, that they carbon dated them back to like 5500 BC. Making this the location of the oldest dated cemetery in eastern North America. Pretty amazing, huh? Normally we don't associate ancient peoples with Wisconsin, much less a small town like Oconto, but yet it's here. By the way, there is a museum here that you can check out. It's open, I believe, only during the summer. Both Marty and I have been inside. I'd say it's definitely worth a visit if you're in the area and you really like archaeological sites, you're into history, or you're a museum buff. By the way, I believe this is the only state park in Wisconsin where you don't have to pay an entrance fee. Or at least one of the few. Now, one of the more well-known Native Americans associated with Oconto is a woman by the name of Susie Michequet. Often referred to as Oconto's true daughter, Susie moved here as a young girl to the Menominee Indian village that used to sit where Oconto is now. She married a man by the name of John Michequet, and they lived in the old Astor trading post at Oconto. Later they moved into a small framed cabin atop a sand hill, which eventually became known as Susie's Hill. After her husband's death, Susie stayed living up atop the sand hill. To this day, this area is known as Susie's Hill. Susie, by the way, lived to the ripe old age of 109. Susie wasn't the only Oconto resident to live on this hill. In 1836, George Lurick built a sawmill and home here. Although lumbering was huge in making Oconto what it is today, other industries eventually replaced it, including recreational boat making and the pickle factory. And speaking of that pickle factory, by the way, sightseers, I thought some of you would be interested in knowing that I was able to track down the approximate location of the former Bond Pickle Company. You're looking at it, the site of the former Bond Pickle Company is now home to the Dollar Tree and an O'Reilly Auto Parts store. Or, bear with me, it could have been here, where mini golf and apartments now sit. Either way, we're in the ballpark.